Hello and welcome to Pagabo Live, a new initiative designed to promote knowledge in the public sector. My name is Tom, and over the next hour, we'll be talking about the upcoming changes to the Procurement Act and how the public sector can prepare itself for them. And to help us do that, we have a panel of industry experts.
Hi, I'm Rosie Edge. I'm National Framework Director at Graham Construction.
I'm Janet Glenn. I'm Associate Director Commercial at Mace.
And I'm Shemaine Harris, Head of Procurement at Pagabo.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. As with our last Pagabo Live session, today's event is a Q&A. So we'll be going through some of the key questions that have already popped up around the Procurement Act. We'd also love it if you as the audience can get involved as well. So please feel free to do so. If you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, type in your questions there, and hopefully we'll get through the pre-planned questions quickly enough to answer some of your queries as well. We'll also be running polls as usual throughout the session. So please make sure you're responding to those and helping us guide the conversation. And right on cue, we've got our first question. So how aware are you of the upcoming changes to the Procurement Act on a scale of 1 to 4? So 1 being not very aware and 4 being very aware. We'll also ask this question again at the end. So hopefully we'll show that we've grown some public sector knowledge at the end. So just get your votes in now. We've got about 10 seconds left before we close that poll. Brilliant. Ben, if you can close that poll, please. And as the results show, there's the majority of people are in that lower half of awareness. So a few people on 0, which is quite a base level to work from. But those under sort of that 2.5, 3 mark is quite a few. So be looking forward to seeing how that grows over the session. Right, so I think it's probably time that we get on with it. So we'll go with our first question to you, Janet. So what has happened so far as part of the changes to the Procurement Act?
I'll start with back in September 2023, when the Cabinet Office published their Learning Catalogue, which was just prior to Royal Assent being given to the Act in October 2023. So that meant that's it now. It's law, it's a procurement bill, and the go live date is October next year, and you'll all get 6 months notice. So we'll see how that goes. Then in December 2023 last year, and I hope everybody's had a look at these, but there are some free to access knowledge drops on the Cabinet Office website that you can go, and they are aimed at buyers and suppliers. I've looked at the buyer one and the supplier ones, and they do go over what has changed and detailing the changes from the current regs to the new regs. And then in March 2024, there were a couple of events that I went to, and I know a few other people went to, which was a Procurement Act Expo and DPRTE, where they give some more information about what's coming up and what's happening to defence as well. So when I went to DPRT, that was focusing on the defence sector, and they told us what changes will be happening that are pertinent to defence. And the Procurement Act Expo, I sat in the learning zone a lot because a lot of people were in the zone everybody wanted to be in, which is normal. And I gained quite a bit of knowledge from that. So yeah, I know what's happening with the learning, so for the civil servants, and how we can match that in private sector. And then in March 2024 also, some secondary legislation was issued, but it mainly dealt with transparency and the notices that were coming out. So the secondary legislation is coming out in slow sort of drip feeding. We got told at DPRT that this is what would happen, and the guidance as well. So in March, 6 sets of guidances were issued, and then in April, another 5 were issued. And that's how it's going to be from now, I suppose, until hopefully September. And all the secondary legislation, all the guidance will be published, and we'll understand exactly what's going on. And then the e-learning training. So I've had this from a colleague who's working in the Ministry of Defence at the moment. So the e-learning training is being rolled out to civil servants and public servants. So we know that that's going on. And we know that there is some more training to come up for civil servants. What hasn't happened, which we expected to happen at the beginning of April, is the notice period, because they've said October and they're going to give everybody 6 months notice. But that hasn't happened yet. So, you know, keep looking on the website, keep looking on the procurement website, the Cabinet Office one, and seeing if anything happens from there. Have I missed anything? Rosie, Shemaine, have I missed any?
No, you've covered everything there.
Okay.
Well, there you go. Well, we've still got 2 weeks left of April, so fingers crossed. We might just get into time.
Who knows? Who knows?
Brilliant. So we'll move on to the next question. We'll put this one to you, Shemaine. So what are the objectives then of these changes to the Procurement Act?
Yeah, thank you. So there are 4 core objectives of the Procurement Act. So the first one being creating a simpler and more flexible commercial system that better meets our country's needs whilst remaining compliant. So that's going to be created by replacing the current public contract regulations, utilities contract regulations, defence and security regulations, and concession contract regulations into one consolidated set. And it will also be delivered by updating the procedures aimed at simplifying and enhancing flexibility. So including the introduction of an open framework and dynamic markets to facilitate supplier diversity and innovation. The second core objective is opening up public procurement to new entrants and contracting authorities having a duty to consider small businesses and social enterprises so that they can compete for and win more public contracts. The third core objective is taking tougher action on underperforming suppliers and excluding suppliers who pose unacceptable risks. So the Act will put in place a new exclusion framework that will make it easier to exclude suppliers who have underperformed on contracts. And it will also create a new debarment register, and that will be accessible to all public sector organisations. And then the fourth core objective is embedding transparency through the commercial life cycle. So that the spending of taxpayers' money can be properly scrutinised, and this will be delivered by providing access to public procurement data and spending decisions, and suppliers will be able to identify new opportunities to bid and collaborate. Buyers will be able to analyse the market and benchmark their performance against others on elements such as SME spend. So all those objectives are aimed at making the new procurement regime different and better. It's a huge opportunity for procurement teams and suppliers in the public sector to embrace that flexibility and innovation.
Brilliant, very comprehensive. Thank you, Shemaine. So we'll go back to you for this one, for Janet, but I think it's definitely one where I think everyone can probably chip in to some degree. What core provisions are being changed then with the Act?
So there's quite a few. There's quite a few changes. So there's the ability to favour UK suppliers and suppliers from countries with reciprocal arrangements or treaties. So gone is the transparency across the EU because we Brexited, and that's what this is all about. It's about us leaving the EU and having our own procurement regulations. There'll be a new remedies and automatic suspension test, which Shemaine alluded to, which will apply to suppliers. There's a national procurement policy statement, which will be produced annually, which will set out the government's, the wider policy objectives to which it expects the public sector, the public procurement to contribute to. And then there'll also be a single digital platform. So at the moment, we've got Contracts Finder and we've got Finder Tender. The intention is to have one single platform, which will be accessible. So if you've already got an e-procurement system, the idea is that e-procurement system will feed into this one single tender platform. It will make it easier for all suppliers, including SMEs, to find new opportunities on there, which I think is a really good thing. The large contracting authorities with £100 million plus spend per annum, this relates back to what Shemaine said, they're required to publish future procurement pipelines, so it'd be more transparent what's coming up for us suppliers next year to bid into. So if you've got, if you want to set out your own policy procurement strategy for the year, you can look at the pipelines and see what's on there, but it is only contracting authorities with spend £100 million plus. There'll be more transparency, so there are more notices. We have about 3 to 4 notices at the moment. It's going to 18, circa 19. So in the 18, I don't think the one where you have to publish 30k plus invoice payments is included in that 18. But recently, the secondary legislation on that was produced. So you can go and have a look at that. That's quite interesting read, but it is only related mainly to the notices. There is a £5 million threshold for publishing KPIs, so that will affect all suppliers as well. So if your contract is £5 million or over, which most may are because they're construction, they'll have their KPIs will have to be published. There's a more robust development process, which again Shemaine alluded to. And when I went to the Procurement Act Expo, it was quite scary to see how far that went, because it even talks about sister companies. We have a sister company which is Mace Construct, we're Mace Consult. If any one of us gets on that debarment list, it affects the whole organisations, and the reason for getting on that list is quite wide ranging as well. So, and you have to demonstrate you have put right the reason you got on the list to get off the list. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how that's used. There'll be a more robust process for determining what constitutes a conflict of interest and how to address it. And one of the current guides out now is on conflict of interest. There'll be a procurement review unit, which I suspect is going to replace the competitions panel and the, what do they call it? The thing that CCS do, the secret squirrel, that they come in and look at whether you're running your procurements compliantly. So I think that will, and they're going to investigate suppliers and buyers, I believe, as well, for poor practice. There's a requirement to provide assessment information for final tender, provide better feedback and more consistent feedback. It's going from 5 award procedures to 3 award procedures. So that's quite a big change. So they're getting rid of quite a few of the other procedures, and then they've got this competitive flexible. They're going from the most advantageous tender to the most advantageous tender. So the most economically advantageous tender to the most advantageous tender, which we're going to talk about a bit more later on in this session. And public sector will expect it to have less emphasis on price and more on things, the softer stuff like social value, the softer, what they call fluffy stuff. For the defence regulations, Schedule 10, there are a lot of changes against the single source regulations. That's definitely one to look for if you're in the defence and you get a lot of single source contracts, or you are issuing a lot of single source contracts. There'll be certain differences for defence and utilities and for devolved authorities as well. So there's nuances for those sectors. And I'll hand over to Rosie now to talk about frameworks and changes to
Thanks, Janet.
frameworks.
Thank you. So the Act introduces 2 types of frameworks, open and closed. The closed frameworks are largely similar to the conventional frameworks or the existing frameworks that we have now, in that there's a set number of suppliers that retain their position on that framework for the duration of the framework. Under the Act, the closed frameworks will have a maximum duration of 4 years, apart from defence and utilities, which will be 8 years. There would be an option to potentially to extend those durations, but there is a requirement to provide justification for that. They've also then introduced a new type of framework called an open framework. And this provides greater flexibility in a lot of ways to appoint new suppliers to the framework throughout its duration. It's effectively a scheme of frameworks where each successive framework is awarded on the same terms as the initial framework was. As I said, new suppliers can be appointed at defined points within that duration. There is still a maximum of 8 years. The first framework would need to be, or new entrants would be allowed within the first 3 years, and then again within the next 5 years. So there are certain defined points when new suppliers can be introduced to that framework. And I think the idea around that is to try and prevent frameworks being closed off for a long period of time to suppliers and increase innovation potentially. From my understanding, existing suppliers can only be, new suppliers can only be introduced if there is no maximum to the number of suppliers that are appointed to that framework. So I still think there's a little bit of clarity needed around how an open framework will work in practice, and how existing suppliers will compete against any new suppliers trying to join that framework. There's some guidance in the Act around how existing suppliers will be assessed there, around using their original tender submission perhaps, or a mini competition. But I'm not entirely clear myself on how they would assess new suppliers versus existing suppliers. So I think there's a little bit more to come out around that.
Brilliant. Well, there's obviously a very comprehensive bank of knowledge on this call. So this is a good start. Thank you very much, guys. So we're going to move on to one more question before we go on to our first.
Sorry. The only thing we missed was dynamic markets, which I think will be more for the catalogue type So there's going to be a dynamic market. I don't know enough about the dynamic markets yet because we've not had the guidance out. But I think that will be around setting up catalogues, as CCS are so good at doing. So there'll also be dynamic markets where I think they're a type of framework. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Janet. So yes, we'll move on to let's say one more question before we get on to our next poll question. This one's we'll go to you with this one, Shemaine. So some of the key terminology, what is the key terminology that's been changed as part of the Act?
Yeah, thank you. So, well, it's probably worth pointing out that the objective to create a simpler system is supported by some changes in terminology. So the Act introduces several new concepts along with new terminology into procurement law, and it also adapts some new terminology for existing concepts that we're quite familiar with. So the core objective is to move away from any EU language and terminology. So some of the language is quite familiar, but there is also an attempt to relax the language. So it's intended to be more permissive. So it uses permissive language for contracting authorities. So it allows the contracting authority to make decisions and use discretions when making those decisions. It could create a greater risk of challenge as a means to force the courts to provide guidance through case law. And there are also some subtle changes through the use of may and must throughout. I've selected some of the new terminology and then some of the rebranded terminology to provide a summary of those changes today. So focusing on the new, so obviously we've got quite a few new notices, as Janet's mentioned. So those will come along with new terminology. So that covers things like the terminology notice, dynamic market notice, below threshold notice. And these are supported by the recently issued guidance on what they cover and what they apply to. Terminologies such as the debarment list, which is obviously a list of suppliers excluded by those mandatory or discretionary exclusion grounds, and conflicts assessments, so an assessment of conflicts and potential conflicts in relation to the procurement or the dynamic market. Just a couple of changes to existing terminology then, where we've seen that switch. The current central purchasing body is replaced by centralised procurement authority. The current contract award notice is replaced by a contracts details notice. Dynamic purchasing system replaced with the dynamic market. Obviously, we've talked about the meat versus mat and that replacement. There are some really helpful terminology and procurement phrase books that are available online, which are really handy, a handy resource when you're looking through this information. So I can signpost those in the follow-up materials that come after the webinar.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Shemaine. Yes, as Shemaine mentioned, some of the guidance and the detail that's been mentioned today. I appreciate there's quite a lot to take in as people are talking. So some of that will be shared with the newsletter following the webinar. We'll move on to another poll question now before we move on to the next section of the webinar. And if we could open that poll now, please, Ben. Thank you. So what concerns you the most about the upcoming changes to the Procurement Act 2023? Is it uncertainty? Is it training requirements, changes to legislation and terminology, the team resources needed, the timescales, data management, or the deliberately vague other? So we'll see how we go there. Hopefully we haven't got 98% other, because that would be very, very disappointing. But let's just give that 10 more seconds before we wrap that up and take a look. Ben, if you could close that poll now, please. Thank you very much. And as we've just alluded to in that previous section, the changes to legislation and terminology, running away with that at 38% of attendees that voted, saying that is the biggest issue. So yeah, just to reiterate, we will be sending around as much guidance and notices that we can provide at the end of this webinar. Brilliant. So we'll move on to it was something that we mentioned earlier, and we'll go to you with this one, Janet. As you mentioned it earlier, is social value now then being placed more at the forefront of procurement? and the change from meat to MAT, is that a step in the right direction?
Social value will be. I think that's a yes, definitely. I think the Cabinet Office are pushing for it to be more at the forefront. I do think they need to review it because there's still one in there that's for COVID-19 and it's gone. So they did say they were replacing that in 2021, but they haven't done anything with it yet. But yes, I do think that they'll be looking at other things rather than price. So at the moment, everybody's going to price. Is it a step in the right direction? It is a step in, but there's always a but to these things. It is a step in the right direction, but is there the funding there to be able to do that? So we know how tight funding is for certain central authorities and local authorities, to be honest, for everybody. So is the money going to be there to be able to do that? So you get a tender in, the cheapest is affordable, but the one that comes out on top because you've put more weighting against the other things, that the other criteria that you've put forward, you know, and it's not affordable. So, you know, it's difficult to see how in the current economic climate any contracting authority can move away from meat to completely move to MAT. But it's a good thing. But then is it really going to be practical?
A step in the right direction, but possibly not a realistic one.
Well, yeah, you know, the money has to be there, and
yeah.
Is the money there is the question, I think, for most authorities that I've been talking to. Anybody got anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think procurers must be really cautious when applying this because it is less prescriptive, and it's to make sure that the MAT approach doesn't lead to any disproportionate requirements or weightings that may unnecessarily create barriers for competition, especially with SMEs.
Yeah, completely agree.
No, I would just add to that as well. I guess from a supplier's perspective, it is a positive step, and hopefully it will allow the sort of us to demonstrate that value for money goes beyond cheapest price, and will avoid some of the sort of race to the bottom that can happen in the industry, in the construction industry particularly, and unsustainable pricing. So what I found interesting, what I found good about it was that the contracting authorities have to provide evidence that they've picked the most advantageous tender as part of that award assessment summary. So for suppliers, that will hopefully improve that transparency around the selection process, and also help suppliers to improve next time as well if they can get that good feedback on where they need to improve next time. So yeah, I do see it as a positive step.
If they're going to make that feedback consistent and robust, more robust than it is now, then yeah, that will resolve that
hopefully.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we've got a question. I'm going to post this to all of you, given that we've got people with backgrounds in as buyers, suppliers, and also the frameworks on this panel. What does collaboration look like between framework provider, consultant, contractor, and the public sector after these changes? We'll go with you first for this one, Shemaine, but feel free to chip in anybody that would like to put a response in.
Thank you. So commitment to collaboration is essential to improve value and manage risks. And the reform provides some really key provisions to allow that to be delivered. So as I've mentioned earlier, the system will be simpler, and it will help suppliers work more collaboratively with procurers to reduce costs and deliver fit-for-purpose solutions. The transparency agenda of the reform will really underpin and provide a mechanism for collaboration. So that will be delivered through the use of notices. Specifically in the planning stages, there are a number of new notices that can really support collaboration in the planning stages. Effective collaboration through pre-market engagement will allow the contracting authorities to design a procurement process aligned to the market without unnecessary barriers. But sort of in summary, the provisions are available in the new Act to encourage collaboration, but some of these provisions are also available in the current regulations. So there needs to be an emphasis placed on behaviour changes and resisting the urge to replicate current behaviours to avoid that quick fix mentality that would reduce the ability to collaborate. So it's quite a big behaviour change as well that's needed.
Rosie, from a contractor's perspective, how does that look for you?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, Shemaine covered it really well there. I don't have a great deal to add to that. It was sort of similar thoughts really around that. I think that the early market engagement is always seen as a positive step to allow the suppliers to shape the procurement process and the strategy that's taken. So that, I mean, that exists already, but hopefully we'll have an increased focus with the new regulations as well.
Brilliant. Janet, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, just to say that hopefully SMEs will get more of a collaborative work within this, because hopefully that will help them. So if they're encouraging a collaboration and an SME's got a really whizzy piece of kit that can go on a tank or a ship, talking defence, then that they can then enter the marketplace because they count towards the government's figures on contracting with SMEs. And also less of them and us would be good. Partnership working, more partnership. Yes, you're the contractor, we're the buyer, less of that, more partnership working, which I really do believe in, hopefully.
Brilliant. Well, we're rattling through these questions, but there are still time to get yours in. Make sure you're using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's the best way to get your questions to the panel. We're around halfway through our slides, so hoping that we'll be able to get a few of your questions in before we wrap up today. But before we move on to the next section, let's take a look at our next poll. And if you could open that now, please, Ben. Thank you. So are you aware of the training that will be made available surrounding the Procurement Act 2023 changes? Are you aware of the training that will be made available surrounding the Procurement Act changes? I have to give that another 10 seconds for people to vote. Brilliant. So if you can close that poll now, Ben, thank you. So that's interesting. We've got around 70% of the votes saying that they aren't aware of the training that will be made available to tell people around the changes to the Procurement Act. So that's a really interesting way to move on to the next question. We'll go to you with this one to start off with, Janet. What's been done then to train and upskill the public sector? Because obviously people are feeling that they don't have enough training just yet.
Well, when we feed back from this session, if you could include the link to the Transforming Public Procurement, there are some knowledge drops on there, which I think I mentioned earlier. They are free for everyone, so they can be accessed. I've been on them. I know a lot of my colleagues have been on them as well. There's solicitors, there's law firms that are offering a lot of webinars. I've been on quite a few of them as well. So Mills and Reed, Bevan Britton, the usual suspects, are offering up webinars to go through what are the changes between the two. Obviously, at the moment, because we're still waiting for the rest of the secondary legislation plus the guidance that is coming out dribs and drabs, we can't really do anything more than doing the awareness. So there's some e-learning coming out, but I believe it's only open to civil servants and public servants. It's not open to contractors. So if you're working client side, like a lot of my colleagues are, you're not going to get access to that training. But there is e-learning being issued by the Government Commercial College. And there is going to be some expert training, looking at what the Cabinet Office are offering up. The Cabinet Office are offering expert training, which again is going to be through the Government Commercial College and only for civil and public servants. So again, contractors won't be able to access that one. And then the Cabinet Office are doing a community of practice. Now, they haven't given a lot of detail about who will be included in that. So I don't know whether suppliers will be included that or contractors that are working as a buyer in the public sector. But they are going to be doing a community of practice, which is going to support the learning. It's going to be somewhere you can share best practice, somewhere, especially around the competitive flexible procedure, where you can say, what have you tried for this? And people can chip in with what they've tried and any innovations that they've done in the procurement sector. So I can see that being quite well used going forward. But again, we don't have enough guidance on it at the moment, and I don't think they can do the expert training till all the guidance and the secondary legislation has come out, is from what I understand. So that's the training that's on offer at the moment. But there is a few free things out there, like the webinar the law firms do and the knowledge drops.
Thanks, Janet. We'll move on to you for this one, Shemaine. So let's take a look. So are the timescales set out then by the government to introduce these changes? Are they realistic?
So the timeline we're currently working towards, and we've kind of all alluded to this on the webinar, is a 6-month notice period prior to the planned go live date in October. So we've yet to receive that official 6-month notification. So I expect there to be some flex on the October go live, unless we receive it in the next week and a half. But I'd say, considering the current state of play, the timescales are quite ambitious. However, the government has reiterated its commitment to the October go live date in a recent update at the end of March. It's expected that the implementation will be in successive phases, which will make October potentially more achievable. And the guidance is being issued currently, with some latest updates that were issued on the 12th of April. But it was quite heavily focused on notices. So there's still a lot of outstanding key guidance. And the expectation is this guidance will continue to be issued up until June. One of the biggest changes to really underpin the delivery is the central digital platform, which we're yet to really have sight of the changes and the updates to that. So that obviously includes the enhanced version of Find a Tender, which will provide the new procurement notices and a new supplier information service, and they will have a single sign-on. So I suppose it's TBC until we get to the end of the month to see if we receive that formal notice, but it is still fairly ambitious at this point, I would say.
I think that's a very, very polite way of putting it, Shemaine. Ambitious, yeah. We'll move on to actually, this is the final question that we've got pre-submitted. We do have plenty of audience questions coming in, so thank you very much for those. So how can the public sector prepare for these changes? We'll go to you first on this one, Shemaine, then you, Janet, and then we'll wrap up with you on that one, Rosie.
Thank you. I suppose what we've all alluded to is that there's a wealth of information available to support preparations. The biggest impact considerations really should be focused on resources, standard practices and procedures, training and development and communications. And I'd really urge practitioners to develop an implementation plan in consideration of those impacts ahead of the planned October go live date. Consideration should be made of upcoming pipelines of projects and those affected contracts that are planned around that October date to consider whether there's options to bring that procurement forward and allow any decisions to be communicated in a reasonable time frame. As we've touched on again, the guidance and training has been designed and separated into subcategories for contracting authorities, suppliers and SMEs, and those are available for all. The e-learning and the deep dives will be made available via the Government Commercial College that will require learners to register to access, and obviously that access unfortunately has some restrictions. So I suppose just to summarise, the knowledge drops are available to all and accessible to all. The e-learning is aimed at skilled practitioner level. The advanced course deep dives are aimed at expert practitioner level, and the communities of practice have been pitched at a skilled and expert practitioner level. So that provides an overview of what those different terminologies are and who they're aimed at.
Brilliant, thanks, Shemaine. Janet, your view on this one?
I'm going to defer back to the previous question, and it's related to this, is that there's a general election somewhere in there. So as far as timescales go, and we know what happens with central authorities because they have what they call PERDA, where they will not be able to award a contract. So how that's going to affect the likes of business cases going through to the Treasury. So you need to be thinking what you've got on your plate, what you need to deliver before October, and then what you can defer till after October, because as Shemaine said, you need to be really planning now, because once you hit October, and we don't know, and they've said it, there's going to be a phased implementation. Well, what does that look like? Nobody's actually said what that's going to look like. What does phased implementation? We know that indications are anything that's currently EU up until that date will stay EU regs, but then anything after that date has to be under the new Procurement Act. But then they've said, and yes, it's going to be in phase. So a little confused by that. So hopefully we'll get that guidance out. But yeah, I think there's a lot to do. As Shemaine's alluded to, I can't add anything to what she said about resourcing and getting yourself upskilled. I will say the e-learning training is being rolled out at the moment. I know that because I've spoke to one of my colleagues that's actually working in the Ministry of Defence. He's a contractor, so he can't access it. So they are only aiming that at civil servants in the Ministry of Defence. And if they're rolling it out, I assume that all the other authorities are rolling the awareness training out. But and this is not to disagree with anything that's been said here, I think the awareness training should be for everyone that's actually working on a delivery contract. So PMs, risk managers, project control, schedulers, they should all be going to that awareness training, because I think it's very relevant and will impact if you're dealing with a contract, or you're in a contract, or you've got anything to do with the procurement.
Thanks, Janet. Rosie, anything to add on that one?
Not a great deal, because from a supplier's perspective, it's slightly different, and how we're preparing. As Janet and Shemaine have said, some of the e-learning isn't available to us as suppliers, but we are looking at the knowledge drops, which is good that they are open to suppliers as well. Obviously trying to upskill bid teams just to understand the new terminology, and looking at the wider impact on the business of the changes. So particularly from my perspective, working within frameworks largely, and a lot of our work's delivered through frameworks, then we're looking at how the open and the closed frameworks might change or have an impact on us. So it's sort of that strategic level at the moment for our business, and as more information is released, that might become more into sort of more of a training program.
Yeah, just to add, sorry Tom, just to add, we are buying our own training at base, because we will need the expert and the awareness level. So we're buying in the expert level for Mace from a law firm, because we cannot access, as Rosie said, we can't access any of the training that's being put on, and we're expected to sit alongside the buyers and buy with them. So we will need to know the regs as well as they do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much to the three of you for your responses to the questions we've had so far. We'll wrap those up with this final poll before going into the audience questions that we can see that are already flying in. So thank you very much, guys, for submitting those. So just to wrap up, how aware are you now of the changes to the Procurement Act 2023? So if you remember from the start, there was quite a low level of awareness. So yeah, if you scale that 1 to 4 or 0 to 4, 0 being not very aware, and 1 as in 4 to being very aware. Just 10 more seconds on that, please, before closing it. Super. So you close that poll now, please, and we can have a look at the results. And that is exactly what we like to see. More than half of people, in fact, 70% of people have gone into that kind of 3 to 4 bracket. So great work from the panel in terms of providing as much information as you guys have available. So thank you very much for those. Great to see the positive results there. So if we can close that up, we'll now go on to our audience Q&A. So if you'd like to get those questions in, we've got around 20 minutes to get through them. So we've got plenty of time to go through as many of those as possible. If you can submit them using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. What we'll do is we'll go to you, Shemaine, for the first question that was submitted. And it's around the terminology, which, as we know from our earlier poll, was one of the biggest issues that people are having with the Procurement Act. You mentioned some of the differences in terminology. What would you say is the biggest and most significant change in terminology that you've seen from the Act so far?
I would say it's the volume of new terminology. There is quite an increase in new referencing and new terminology. Equally, there are sort of going back to my slide earlier, there are a lot of terminology changes. So there will be a lot of, what is currently referred to as one thing is now referred to as something else. And that, in collaboration with just general new provisions and new terminology, is quite a big piece of information to sort of gather and get your head around. So that is really the biggest change. And then where we see that shift in permissive language, that is a very big shift. So it really is a big piece around terminology.
Thanks, Shemaine. We'll go to you, Rosie, for this next one. It refers to something that you were talking about, and in your last response, actually, and open frameworks. And obviously, that sounds incredibly flexible in an industry that never hasn't been known historically for its flexibility. Has it kind of got has something like open frameworks got the opportunity to really change the way the industry works?
It's an interesting question. I'm not convinced that it will entirely. No, I think the way new suppliers can join an open framework, it potentially means that you could have quite large groups of frameworks, suppliers sitting on frameworks, which we tend to find can sometimes reduce collaboration and reduce that opportunity for sort of suppliers to work together and support the framework. So I think there's risks around the open framework and how many suppliers will be permitted onto it and what that would mean. So I don't think it's going to drastically change the industry. That's my view.
That's always very interesting when something that seems fairly open and flexible comes into the built environment, because we're not historically known for having those necessarily those flexible approaches. We'll go to you with this next one, Janet. So do we think there's any way in which the new changes will help avoid larger organizations picking up work by spending money on expensive bid rights? Essentially, that's kind of going back to the SME question, isn't it? And are SMEs getting sort of priced out of it by larger organizations writing very compelling bids?
This is probably better answered by Rosie, to be honest, because all I can say is probably not. I mean, it's just an unfortunate thing that larger organizations, by the very nature they make so much profit, can afford to buy these bid teams in. Mace certainly has their own bid team. Last year I helped an SME get on a framework because they came to me and said, we need help to understand the process, and I was happy to help, but and I was doing it on a voluntary basis for Mace because it's one of our KPIs, funnily enough, on our contract. So it was easy for me to do, but they just, I don't think it's going to make it any easier. I don't know what Rosie thinks, but I don't think it is.
No, I agree with you, Janet. I don't think there's anything in the Act or in anything I've read that would change how that exists currently, that those bid rights can still be employed to support larger organisations.
I think the only benefit is the pre-market engagement piece, which would potentially provide opportunities for that collaboration in the planning stages, which should support SMEs throughout those procurements and those opportunities, and reducing down those barriers. If that's used in the correct manner, that should create those opportunities for SMEs.
Brilliant. Well, we'll stick with you on this one, Shemaine, as it sort of refers to Pagabo directly. Are there any changes to the definition of sort of contract authorities or central purchasing bodies as part of the Act? And does this have an impact on organisations such as Pagabo?
There's no significant changes. There are some minor amends, but nothing significant. And in the summary, no, there's no impact to organisations like Pagabo and framework providers.
Excellent stuff. We'll throw this one to you, Janet, but also feel free to chip in as well, Rosie, on this one. So do you feel the new regulations encourage consideration of whole life cost and not just the initial construction cost?
Sort of encourage that myself. I mean, I always did whole life costs as a buyer, so I don't think it's that much different. We were always encouraged to do it, but we just weren't told we had to do it. So yeah, the way the economic climate is at the moment, you have to do whole life costing because you have to make sure that it is going to be affordable into the future life of that contract, and that there is going to be money coming out of the public purse to be able to do that. So I don't think I think most buying organisations will do whole life costing. I don't think it's that big a change. I don't know what anyone else thinks, but that's what I think. Rosie? I
think it will come down to the individual contracting authority and how they set their evaluation criteria to take it into consideration. It would allow, if that was set that way, and then that was part of the categorization of how you demonstrate the most advantageous offer by most advantageous tender, then yes, it would take into consideration. But as you said, Jan, I don't think it drastically changes from kind of where we are now. That already can form part of the evaluation criteria currently. So it's really down to the individual authority, I think, to make that decision.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. Shemaine, one for you here. So has any guidance been issued on mandatory standstill periods, and do the principles continue to apply, or has this changed under this new sort of agenda around transparency?
Yeah, so there are actually some subtle changes. So definitely the terminology has changed. The biggest key difference is that we are no longer working towards 10 calendar days, and there's a switch to 8 working days. So that is a shift. And the process in which standstill periods will start has changed with the introduction of new notices. So there'll be the requirement to publish a notice prior to standstill being entered into, which is quite a big change, and it does create a bigger administrative burden on contracting authorities and procurers to move through those processes prior to standstill. So that's a very big change, but it supports that transparency agenda.
Super. So we're going to push this one out to, we'll go to you, Rosie, with this one. Do you feel that competitive dialogue still has a place within these new procurement regulations?
I believe so, but I have to say I'm not an expert on that. So I don't know whether Shemaine or Janet might know more on how that fits within the new regulations and how it's defined.
Janet's nodding away.
It's not defined.
Okay.
It's like we've got this procedure and you can do anything. I think, because I saw one of the questions asking about the legal challenges on this, I think if in your ITT, and I was told this by a solicitor that at a council I once worked at, if you're open and transparent in your ITT and no one challenges the ITT, then they can't take any action against you because they've seen what you're trying to do. So it will still have a place, but I'm kind of hoping people don't always go to the current 5 procedures that we've got and try new things. So try, demonstrations as part of the ITT, try new ways of buying stuff. And it's not always going to be, we did one for a heavy lift challenge, and we actually had them doing a circuit as part of the ITT at an airbase, and it worked really well, and we were scoring them as they did their various bits and pieces. So it's a bit like a crypto factor for drones, but that's the sort of thing we want to see. We want to see more of, that's equipment. Obviously you can't do it for construction, but for equipment you could do it, and we don't just want to see more of that kind of thing. I think everybody's expecting, and I think it's what will happen in the first stages, is everybody will defer to the restrictive procedure, the competitive procedure, and all, the current procedures we have. And I'm hoping that doesn't happen, and over time people get more confident about knowing what they can do, as long as they're transparent to the whole market, as long as they let the whole market know how they can get on, and it's open for anybody to get on. They're not debarring anybody by, that's a wrong word to use, but excluding anybody by doing it a certain way. Then the world's your oyster with that one, I think.
Well, you preempted the next question around the legal challenges, Janet, there.
Yes.
So we'll
I saw that question. I was thinking it was very related to this one, really, because I think people will defer to competitive negotiated and the restricted, and I'm kind of hoping that over time people will move away and find more innovative ways of buying.
And hopefully they'll use the early market engagement to sort of consult with the market on the best way to procure and the best route to use. And really that should depend on the sort of scope and complexity of the project or equipment that they're procuring. And that's only going to increase attractiveness to the market and get more competition. So really hope that will be used a lot more to sort of shape what is used as a procurement route.
Yeah,
I think that's where we need to see those behaviour changes and not default to what is currently being practiced, and to really use those new provisions in the way that they were intended. So definitely utilising that pre-market engagement to design a process that's fit for purpose, because we have that flexibility now where we've never had that historically, to create those bespoke routes to market aligned to that solution. So it's a great opportunity, but it does need behaviour changes and effective pre-market engagement to deliver something that's fit for purpose.
That behavioural change piece is quite interesting. It feeds into sort of one of the penultimate questions that I was going to pose to you guys. Obviously, the construction playbook seems like a long time ago now, but are these changes? Is the new Procurement Act? Is this the construction playbook in action? Is this kind of it living out the promise that it came with all those years ago? Shemaine, we'll go to you on this one first, but feel free to chip in with any thoughts, guys.
Definitely, I think that focus on collaboration is there, and those opportunities are there, but it does need a behaviour change. It needs quite a big change. The provisions are there; they need to be utilised in the way that they were intended. So, yeah, ultimately, in a nutshell, yes.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll just wanting to see whether any more questions are coming. So we're running a little short on time. We've got questions coming from Richard Ward, and I think it's being sort of mentioned in terms of potential phasing rather than transitional arrangements. But are there going to be any transitional arrangements available as part of the Procurement Act? Is there any provision for that, Shemaine?
If this question is focused on the phasing of the new provisions, then yes, I expect there to be the pre-market engagement, early planning, procurement stages to be implemented initially, and then we may see some of the new provisions around framework and contract management, so those KPI changes, etc. I expect those to be phased in at a later stage when they're most likely to be used. It's incredibly unrealistic for this entire regime to go live in October. So if we are still working towards the October go live date, which is the guidance we've been given, the only way to deliver that would be a phased approach, and it's reasonable to expect the early stages to be phased in first.
They have indicated they're going to give a 6-month phasing period, but they haven't been explicit about what that is. So
yeah,
I think we have to just wait for that guidance to come out. It's another piece of guidance we're waiting for.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. Question from Dan Anderson. I'll stick with you on this one, Janet, but as I say, feel free to chip in, guys, if you feel that they've got an opinion on this. Do you feel like the new regulations strengthen the robustness of client scrutiny of bids? So does it remove the idea of strategic pricing?
It's supposed to. It's what I'll say. And if the MAT is used in its proper, as it's intended, then it will. But it does again come down to affordability, and I still think that's a big issue for this MAT, using this new way of doing things, MAT POS, to meet, because the money has to be there to be able to procure that quality that you want out of it rather than price. So I hope it does. It's just, will they make the money available? Will the authorities have enough money to be able to do that? So I hope it does.
We can but hope.
We can, but yeah, but time will tell.
Super. And final question, just to wrap us up for today. We talk a lot at the moment about the gold standard for frameworks and how that is going to be, how that's going to look in the future. Do we think that this Procurement Act moves us closer to that gold standard for frameworks? Start with you on this one, Rosie, but we can pass it around the team.
I'm not sure the Procurement Act itself does. I mean, hopefully the gold standard is a really good set of recommendations for frameworks. And as a supplier, there are so many frameworks out there. So it's really good to sort of set a standard for how those frameworks should be managed. The Procurement Act on frameworks apart from defining the sort of closed and open frameworks, doesn't really say a lot around how those frameworks should be managed. So as far as I've seen, I don't think there's a lot in there that really aligns with the gold standard at the moment. I don't know if Shemaine or Janet disagree on that or have seen anything further than I have.
No, I agree. There's a general lack of updates focused specifically on frameworks, but you'd like to see that best practice being utilised where possible. So you would like to make sure that that's being utilised. And that transparency piece, it's coming back to that transparency piece. that applies to sort of both sides of that procurement opportunity. So it will create that mechanism to be transparent around what is being utilised and how that's been carried out by framework providers.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to Janet, to Rosie, and to Shemaine for their time today. That is unfortunately all we've got time for, but thank you for tuning in again. Various points, we have more than 200 people tuning in today. I know a few of the guys were a little bit nervous about speaking to that many people at the start, so we've done a really good job of getting through that and building that public sector knowledge. Obviously, there has been a lot of detail in today's webinar, or as much detail as we can give. So there will be signposts to all the existing government guidance and all those training resources that we've mentioned in the newsletter that will come around after this webinar. And as part of that, there'll be a link to a recording of the webinar for those of you who maybe missed some of it. And also you'll have that in podcast form, so you can listen to our dulcet tones when you're driving or doing the washing up. Our next webinar is actually, our next session, sorry, isn't going to be a webinar. It's going to be a very exciting one. We'll actually be live at UK Reef in person, talking about how efficiency can be driven through early developer engagement. So if you are attending UK Reef and you are in the compound at the Royal Armouries, you can join us in the Pagabo Pavilion from 1 p.m. on the Wednesday, which is the 22nd of May. But if not, a recording will be made available in the usual newsletter, and there'll also be a podcast available a week after the episode. As it is a live panel session at UK Reef, we'll be cancelling the Zoom link for the May invite. So don't worry if you see that being cancelled in your diary. That's just because we are doing a live version in person at UK Reef. But hopefully you've enjoyed yourselves today. You found it very useful. And if you have done, please, get people involved in the Pagabo Live community. Tell a colleague, tell a friend, tell your auntie, and make sure that you catch up with us next month. We'll be back for a very special UK Reef live edition of Pagabo Live. Thank you very much.